We're getting close to the end of the semester here. We've had a number of great seminars, and today is no exception. Before I talk about and introduce today's speaker, let me just tell you about the basically last two events that we're going to have in this space over the course of the semester, both of which will occur next week. So next Wednesday at this same time, we will have a presentation, an interesting interdisciplinary presentation by an economist, an atmospheric chemist, and an environmental modeler in Bruce Larson, Jeffrey Geddes, and Arden Radford. And they will present a paper called Estimating the Social Costs of 21st Century Coal-Fired Power, Evidence from a Chinese Financed Power Plant in Pakistan. And then the next day, on Thursday, December 10th at 9:30. So for those of you who want to get a little more sleep, if you're on the East Coast, or if you want to finish your dinner somewhere else in the world, that one will be at 9:30 a.m. EST. And that'll be a launch of a new database here at the Global Development Policy Center, different than from the one that just looked at Chinese overseas power plants. We now have a new database that looks from 2008 to 2019 and identifies all of the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China's overseas finance projects during that entire period, and also geolocates each of those and allows users through an interactive database to juxtapose those projects next to biodiversity and indigenous lands across the world. Very interesting data set. And if you look in the chat here, you can sign up for those different events. So really encourage you to come and join us for those two. Well, today I'm excited to introduce Meir Alkon. Meir is an environmental fellow, postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University. He's also a Global China fellow, a postdoc here at the Global Development Policy Center. He holds a PhD from Princeton University in political science and has a number of published articles in this space. Today he's going to be presenting some new work in progress called Global Markets, Domestic Reforms, the Political Economy of Chinese Overseas Investments. The way we do these, if you're new to the seminar, please allow Dr. Alkon to give a presentation for 25 or 30 minutes or so. And as you're listening, you can go into the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom there, and please introduce yourself, tell us your name and affiliation, and then add a question. When Dr. Alkon's done with his presentation, then I'll field 3 or 4 of those questions at a time, ask them to him, and hopefully we'll be able to have some space to do a couple of rounds of those during the period. So thanks so much for joining us, and looking forward to your presentation. Take it away, Meir.
Thank you. So let me share my screen, but I'll first say, with apologies, that there's a little bit of a bait and switch here. I am going to talk about global markets, domestic reforms, but I'm first going to talk about China's larger carbon conundrum and the political economy of China's domestic energy transition and how this affects the international dimensions of China's overseas investments. Can everyone see my screen and the slides?
Yes, we can.
Great. So about 2 months ago, Xi Jinping, China's leader, announced a bold new goal of taking China to carbon neutrality by 2060. This announcement built on previous prominent international statements by China positioning itself as a climate leader, including an increased role during the Trump administration for China's role in the Paris Agreement as the US stepped away from its role in global climate change, and previous bilateral agreements with the Obama administration. However, these bold international statements do contradict with the reality that we see on the ground, which is the fact that China continues to sponsor polluting, heavily carbon emitting coal-fired power plants through much of the world, as has been documented in great detail by the GDP Center's own China Global Power data. This paradox and contradiction also exists at the domestic scale. We see the rollout of wind and solar capacity accompanied by the continued construction of carbon-intensive, heavily polluting coal-fired power. Now, understanding this paradox has incredibly large implications for two reasons. First is China's own role as the world's largest emitter, almost twice as large a contributor as the next biggest country, the US, as well as its role in fostering or limiting sustainable and low carbon development throughout the world. We know there's a global infrastructure investment shortfall. There are rapid increases in electricity demand. In this context, China, as a prominent investor and technology exporter, has a crucial role to play. And by greening China's overseas investments, this would be the single biggest lever that we have to build a low carbon and sustainable energy sector globally. This is because it's easier and cheaper to build clean and avoid carbon lock-in, and because once investments are made, vested interests are created. And beyond these issues of carbon lock-in, there's also many issues caused by energy infrastructure in terms of local sustainability, which really highlight the trade-off between different sustainable development goals. So I want to highlight the environmental paradox of authoritarian capitalism, but let me start off by stating what is authoritarian capitalism. Its two distinguishing elements are first that the government plays a central role in allocating market resources, alongside at least the partial use of pure market mechanisms. This is traditionally what we consider state capitalism. Additionally, in its authoritarian dimension, the dominant goal of this government control is to maintain the ruling regime's political survival. The environmental paradox has three elements. First, it's a behavioral. That is that economic growth, which is attributed to the government, is the foundation of performance legitimacy, but that the externalities of such growth, which include pollution and other environmental challenges, can undermine this legitimacy. Second, it's institutional, because economic growth, on one hand, requires decentralization in order to solve information problems and improve efficiency. But at the same time, we know that some centralization is needed in order to address interjurisdictional environmental externalities, such as pollution. And this has important international manifestations. China seeks to burnish its international status and reputation as a global climate leader. However, the imperatives of maintaining domestic political survival and stability in the face of this environmental paradox often push the Chinese government to use international markets as a domestic pressure valve. Today, I'm going to present a couple pieces of empirical research in support of this paradox. And I want to outline the theoretical basis and observable implications and approaches that I take for each. First, I'm going to argue that the public holds government responsible for negative environmental externalities of economic growth. The implication is that pollution undermines regime support. I'm going to show, using an original survey, that is the first to identify the adverse effects of pollution on political attitudes. Second is that there are institutional barriers to a linear, simple energy transition. The implication is that we see alternations in the locus of energy and environmental governance. I'm going to illustrate this with two case studies of coal-fired power and wind energy within China. And this is going to rebut the arguments of authoritarian efficiency in an energy transition. I'll conclude by showing some of the empirical effects that this paradox has on China's overseas investments in the coal-fired power sector. So first, I want to examine the behavioral dimensions, focusing on pollution and political attitudes. And I'll draw here on some co-authored work published in the Journal of Politics in 2019. The fundamental question here is whether citizens in authoritarian capitalist countries hold the government responsible for negative market externalities. Specifically, I'm going to examine this question in the context of air pollution's effects on public attitudes. And answer in the affirmative. Higher pollution leads to lower assessments of the Chinese government on several dimensions and increases the demand for oversight. Now, this is important because we know that authoritarian governments rely on performance legitimacy. In the absence of so-called procedural legitimacy, which accrues through democratic procedures and rules, performance, especially economic growth, is the foundation of political legitimacy in many countries, including China. So in order to bolster the legitimacy, governments actively intervene in the market and rhetorically work to heighten this connection and to take responsibility and claim credit for this role. But paradoxically, this means that by pursuing economic growth at the expense of environmental protection, this can undermine the very legitimacy that that growth is designed to achieve. Now, in looking at the effect of pollution on political attitudes, we might imagine a couple of different approaches that we could take. First would be to think about looking at the individual level. We could focus on differences within individuals across time, but such an approach would make it impossible to rule out individual confounders, omitted variables, or to distinguish between a basket or a bundle of attitudes that are all correlated at the individual level. We could also imagine taking a cross-regional approach. We'd look at differences across individuals who live in different regions. But this is problematic because pollution is endogenous to local politics, and because many of the other things that determine political attitudes might also vary at the local level. In order to surmount these obstacles, we need to exploit exogenous and short-term changes in pollution in order to identify its effects. In doing so, we're going to rely on the end heuristic, which is a psychological and political psychological phenomenon which has been demonstrated in many lab and field experimental studies. And it states that in evaluating and making assessments, individuals place a disproportionate role on the last part of the experience. With such a design, our mechanism is that high pollution raises its salience, bringing it to the forefront of survey respondents' minds. This intensifies the link between pollution and politics. Now, in no way, by highlighting this short-term effects, do I intend to suggest that this is the main or the only way that would affect public opinion. I'm going to rely on an 8-week-long original survey conducted on a daily basis between August and October of 2015, in which every day more than 30 individuals are sampled. This survey asks respondents questions on their political attitudes as well as demographic variables. I'll also rely on air quality data from the US Embassy's air monitoring station in Beijing and verify this with 2 other sources of data. And we'll rely on the fact that short-term variation in air pollution is largely determined by changes in meteorological factors. We see here the variation in the air quality index going up and down during the study period. This slide shows the main outcome measures, which include questions about satisfaction at the local and central level, whether respondents believe that government can do its role without independent supervision, which is really anathema to the fundamental structures of the Chinese system. And finally, whether respondents agree or disagree with the following: that Western countries, especially the US, perpetrate the idea of global warming as a hoax or a conspiracy to constrain China's growth and rise. So we'll estimate models for each of those outcome measures for each individual as a function of daily air quality index, controlling for serial correlation with 2 lag terms of AQI, including indicators for 2 periods during the study in which both pollution and political attitudes may be jointly determined, as well as a vector of demographic covariates. And I emphasize that the only identifying assumption here is that there are no omitted variables that would co-vary with both daily air quality index and individual's opinion. And what we find is that pollution lowers support at both the local and central government, and it also increases demand for independent oversight for both local and central government. We also see that it makes respondents less likely to believe that global warming is a conspiracy put forward by the West to constrain China's rise. Permutation tests and other non-parametric sources show the robustness of our results. We also conduct a placebo test in which we assign individuals to yesterday's pollution values and show that there are no significant effects in such models. Happy to discuss other alternative measurement strategies and robustness tests in the Q&A period. So the implications here are that pollution lowers support for the Chinese regime, and this highlights behavioral dimensions of the environmental paradox, because in economic growth, which has generated this regime legitimacy, can also understand that legitimacy. But it also raises an important puzzle. Given the public cost, what explains China's halting energy and environmental transition? In answering that question, I'm going to draw on two case studies from a paper published this year in Energy Research and Social Science on authoritarian energy transitions. And I'm going to focus on identifying the institutional foundations of the authoritarian environmental paradox, which centers on the tensions between decentralization and centralization. Decentralization is needed for economic efficiency, but centralization is required to achieve and manage interjurisdictional environmental externalities. And so what we see are persistent oscillations in locus of governance between central and local authorities as the government tries to balance these dual competing imperatives. Focusing here on China's energy transition, as the previous findings show, there's a demand due to the concerns about domestic air pollution for making the power sector cleaner. This is further intensified by overcapacity in coal-fired power generation. So we see the central government announce goals to reduce coal consumption, as well as make efforts to rapidly develop renewable energy capacity. At the same time, China is a major producer and consumer of coal. It's a critical input of economic growth and production. And so we see that coal constitutes an important vested interest, and we'll also see that renewables generation faces challenges of scaling and integration. Now, looking specifically at the case of China's coal-fired power sector, I'm going to zoom in on new plant permitting, because this new plant construction really decides the trajectory of plant construction, of use, and of carbon emissions. In general, I'll assume that central government prefers to limit new permits subject to maximizing the efficiency and economic growth that comes from having plants built where they're needed for generating reasons. For provincial governments, the preference is really to permit new coal-fired power plants. This is because career promotion incentives for local governments really prioritize economic growth because of the creation of jobs, the increase in tax revenue, as well as because of the fact that for local government leaders, many of the long-term costs of overcapacity really are not internalized with the short political time horizons that these leaders operate under. This is made worse by a lack of market mechanisms to punish overcapacity, such as allotted run hours and standardized prices, a failure to dispatch energy at its marginal cost of generation. We see that vested interests have influence through provincial policies such as quotas and subsidies, and that state-owned enterprises with interest in coal-fired power generation have tremendous political power, often limiting the clout of environmental bureaucrats. Focusing particularly on the environmental impact assessment of these approvals, we will extend a database of coal-fired power plants that was initially compiled by Greenpeace East Asia and CoalSwarm. And in order to consider some alternatives, we'll also look at data on electricity consumption, provincial revenues, coal prices, coal production. And in 2015, we see that there's a decentralization of approval authority to provincial environmental agencies. The goal is to increase economic efficiency and reduce corruption. Subsequently, we're going to see a spike in the rate of coal-fired power plant approval and a decrease in mean approval time. This will in turn be followed by re-centralization with central government efforts to reassert control over the construction of coal-fired power plants. Visually here, we see with the red vertical bar, representing the decentralization, the substantial spike in both the number of new plants and the number of installed capacity, which is permitted following decentralization to provincial authorities. This is followed by re-centralization, calls for an orderly development in coal-fired power generation, the establishment of risk warning mechanisms to assess provincial conditions. We see suspension and delay, as well as cancellation of a number of plants. However, following this re-centralization, we subsequently see another round of decentralization. This is more de facto. We see loopholes and exemptions, plans providing for people's livelihoods, special regional and national level projects are given leeway in order to allow the information and the efficiency that comes from local provincial officials' involvement in plant permitting and plant construction. This is a recognition of the pain that comes from one-size-fits-all environmental policies. Not to cause whiplash, but this is followed by another round of re-centralization. About a year ago, December 2019, we see new top-down measures to cut coal capacity in key provinces. And this is further evidence of the tug of war and governance oscillations rather than simple one-shot policies and their correctives. In the case of wind energy, we see that there have been large-scale efforts to install renewables capacity as part of achieving key national goals. The central government wants to decentralize this permitting process for wind energy for reasons of efficiency. This delegation leads to a phenomenon of building many smaller and inefficient plants. For local governments, the goal is build, baby, build. Partnering with major state-owned enterprises who invest in wind energy, turbine manufacturing, and power generation with very little regard for the downstream consequences. Each province acts like its own country and has a preference for indigenous generation. So we see is that decentralized overexpansion leads to renewable curtailment and is subsequently followed by central government intervention. Here we see in several key provinces the rapid increases in installed wind generation capacity. And the consequence is serious. It's something that we call curtailment. This is the crowding out of renewable energy sources due to the finite and limited capacity to transmit and connect that power to the grid. This surge in capacity exceeds the ability to upgrade existing transmission lines and is further exacerbated by dispatch rules and by many provincial governments' preferences for dispatching coal-fired power due to the influence of state-owned enterprises that work in coal-fired power generation. The consequences are serious because they stymie the national efforts to transition to renewable energy. They frustrate central government efforts to shift the energy mix. And this consequently, of course, has influences on China's global emissions trajectory. Here we see trends in curtailment over time. And you can see the large increases in curtailment, especially in some of China's northwest provinces. Now, following this increase in curtailment, we see cyclical efforts to intervene and re-centralize with an increase in central government control. Initial efforts in March 2012, coupled with an increase in electricity demand, would lead to a partial decrease in the curtailment rate. However, as electricity demand slightly declined following that, we have an increase in curtailment, followed by central government recognition that much more expansive top-down regulations would be needed in order to control the problem. Only after announcements in the 13th five-year plan and 2017 regulations flagging red alert provinces do we really see that the introduction of top-down quotas and centralized control really leads the curtailment rate to fall. This centralization, decentralization dynamic can be seen in the national wind energy curtailment rates. Here we see the increases, temporary decrease, followed by an increase again, which is only brought down following the 2016 and 2017 measures that are really aimed at implementing more central government oversight. The implications here are that there are fundamental institutional barriers to a clean, straightforward energy transition under authoritarian capitalism. And this is due to the complex interplay between elite interests and the need to decentralize in order to maintain economic growth. Before concluding, I want to briefly turn to the question of how to resolve this paradox, and to the question of whether global markets can be used to alleviate the paradoxes of domestic reforms. We know that on one hand, there are public demands for reform due to the cost of air pollution, but that there are institutional barriers to this reform, as illustrated in the previous case studies. So can international facing policies have a compensatory role? The idea here would be that by redirecting trade and investment flows in service of domestic political goals, authoritarian capitalism actually allows for diversion of reform pressures outward in order to protect the domestic interests. This might explain why we see the rapid expansion of Chinese financed coal-fired power overseas rather than renewables, leading to what some observers call a renewables gap. Briefly going to examine this question with two empirical tests. First, looking at technological choices and the question of whether China is exporting dirty coal. And second, by considering some of the environmental and sustainability implications at the local level of China's sponsoring of coal-fired power. First, focusing on how Chinese sponsorship affects the technology choices in coal-fired power. I'm going to use data on coal-fired power generation globally from the Global Energy Monitor and the Global Coal Plant Tracker, which tracks the technology level for all generating units. I'm going to assign weights for every generating unit to break apart joint ownership. I'll then code technology levels for every unit based on thermal efficiency, pollution control measures, and other advanced technologies, giving them a score between 1 and 5. Finally, to look at the role of home countries and the role of China as a specific sponsor, I'll code every parent firm in the world as either a domestic or overseas sponsor based on the geographic distribution of its investments, and then use the same coding criteria to evaluate whether it's a Chinese firm or a non-Chinese firm. And I want to show 3 stylized facts from this data. First is that the technology levels of foreign investors, as we might expect, do tend to be consistently higher on average than domestic sponsors. Second, when we come to the question of evaluating China's technology versus others, we see an interesting pattern. For the early years of China's outward involvement in the construction of coal-fired power, it was true that Chinese technology levels tended to be behind those of firms from other countries. However, this relationship switched around 2010. And after that, we see that plants constructed in the 2010s by Chinese parents actually tend to be cleaner and to use relatively more advanced technology than plants that are sponsored by other overseas developers. However, when we compare the performance of Chinese firms within China to overseas, we do see that there is a large and growing diversion. In general, the technology level employed by Chinese firms at the yearly level, and every dot here on in this figure shows firm year values for the mean technology level. We show that this level is increasing for Chinese firms domestically as given by the red line, and that while it is increasing for overseas plants at the firm year level built by Chinese, sponsored by Chinese firms, the rate of increase is much slower. So there is a large and growing divergence between this technology level. I want to briefly turn to thinking about some of the local trade-offs between sustainable development and energy access, and how we might think about China's role as a provider of technology and financing in the coal-fired power sector. And this is drawing on a multidisciplinary project which estimated the effects of Chinese-sponsored power plants in Pakistan, focusing on Pakistan as a key showcase and cornerstone of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and thinking specifically about water because many coal-fired power plants require large volumes of water for cooling. Many parts of Pakistan are already water stressed, and this is likely to increase and worsen substantially under climate change. Sorry if the construction, which had briefly stopped before my presentation, has now begun. I'll be done shortly. So The question we ask is whether thirsty coal plants threaten already water-stressed areas. And this what I'm going to present here is going to draw on co-authored work published with a fantastic team of engineers, hydrologists, chemists, and ecologists that asked this question. And this paper was published in 2019 in Energy Policy. And what we show is that much of Pakistan will see substantial increases in water stress through 2055. And at the same time that the cooling water demand from Chinese-sponsored plants is going to increase. And this is largely driven by increasing air temperature. Here we see under SSP2, 5 different global climate models and the projected increase in the water stress index. This increase is positive and significant in 4 out of the 5 models for the nationwide level of Pakistan. When we go specifically to the pixel level and look at the local effects of the water stress, we see that many parts of Pakistan are going to experience large increases in the water stress index, given by the red and purple color here. The black stars, which I hope are coming through clearly in this figure, indicate the location of Chinese-sponsored coal-fired power plants in Pakistan, either existing, under construction, or planned, which we estimate by 2055 will use over 80 million cubic meters of cooling water a year. We see many of these plants coexist with areas that are already water stressed and that are likely to see increasing water stress in the next 30 to 40 years. So I want to briefly discuss the implications of this overseas infrastructure. For Chinese firms and parents, we see that pollution control and efficiency standards overseas are lagging domestic standards. While on one hand, overseas sponsors, especially Chinese sponsors in the last decade, do tend to build cleaner plants, this suggests that there is something of a contradiction here, and that rather than focusing on China's dirty coal, we really need to focus on explaining why we see coal instead of renewables. And this analysis should look at both supply side factors, such as domestic regulators, financing, and the insurers who set the standards and can ensure both that renewables play a larger role in China's overseas investment, and that the standards for coal-fired power plants are at least on par with domestic plants. On the demand side, there are many important questions about why local leaders still prefer to build often inefficient coal-fired power plants. Additionally, we need to consider the local sustainability implications of energy infrastructure. And I think this is a place where there's a real role for multilateral financing agencies to support demand-side policymaking frameworks. This would, first of all, ensure the importance on an emphasis on transparent completion of environmental impact assessments, as well as more multidimensional planning that would include considerations of resource demands, both now as well as how they're likely to change over the lifetime of this infrastructure due to changes in population, economy, and of course, climate. To recap, this morning, I've outlined what I believe to be the main explanation for China's carbon conundrum, which is the environmental paradox of authoritarian capitalism. These are accentuated trade-offs between economic development and environmental governance, which are due to the fundamentals of political structures in such countries. I've identified a behavioral dimension, providing the first evidence of the negative political effects of pollution on public political attitudes, an institutional dimension, showing that the trajectory of coal-fired power generation and wind energy in China is subject to persistent government oscillations, and highlighted a few of the international implications of the paradox. That we may see political compensation by diverting reform pressures outward, and that this may explain partially the kind of contradictory global environmental policies we see from China. I want to conclude by suggesting that these findings take us beyond arguments of authoritarian efficiency or authoritarian environmentalism. Despite the frustration with which many of us in the US and other Western countries view the democratic policymaking around climate mitigation, we have reason to imagine and believe that energy transitions and climate mitigation in authoritarian states faces real and fundamental challenges in its implementation as well. We need new frameworks to understand environmental politics that take into account the unique political economy of authoritarian capitalist contexts. And in the specific context of China and its energy transition, we should expect that we'll face a complex and uncertain path forward, and that this trajectory is likely to have great influence on both local sustainability and the global fight against climate change. So I really appreciate the time and everybody coming, and I'm very much looking forward to comments and questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meir. Everyone in attendance, I encourage you to go into the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom link and introduce yourself and ask a question. We have a nice cluster already that I'll start with these if you don't mind. First, we have Shoaib Kahoot, is a PhD student at Shandong University in China. And student asks, how would such loopholes that you describe in Chinese environmental policies domestically impact Chinese energy investment policy in the Belt Road region? We have a question from Zelda Liang, a visiting scholar at Columbia University. Zelda says, we know that employment provided by state-owned enterprises in the coal, steel, and concrete sectors are also very important for the legitimacy of the Chinese government in China. How do you think that this consideration interacts with the demand for a clean environment? Jerry Harris says that the tension between fossil fuels and green energy also exists in the United States, not just China. Are there transnational links between Western green tech companies and Chinese green companies, as well as US and Chinese fuel corporations? And how do these affect Chinese-US relations? We'll do one more, and then we'll let you answer. I'll take another cluster, so folks, please add them to the Q&A and introduce yourself. We have Sarah Albright. She's a PhD student in political science here at Boston University and research assistant here on the group. She says, I'm wondering about the extent to which this paradox and behavioral response plays out in communities abroad where Chinese finance is behind energy projects. Do we see a similar dynamic of performance legitimacy, portraying China as a partner in economic development / growth, coupled with a negative public opinion when these projects cause environmental damage or social disruption? What implications does this have for China's international legitimacy and reputation in energy and development? Great questions. Please take them away, and we'll do another round or two if we have time.
Yeah, these are fantastic questions. So I think the first one, the question is sort of how do some of the domestic loopholes and these domestic institutional arrangements lead to effects in terms of Belt and Road projects? And I think for me, the most clear and direct effect is that because of these domestic loopholes, it makes it very, very hard for the Chinese government to solve the problems and to solve this paradox purely through domestic policy. Were China an autarky that had no opportunities to send excess capital, excess production capacity abroad to export abroad, the imbalances that these loopholes cause would need to be resolved. I think that because they can export and because they can invest overseas, they can these loopholes can partially persist without the very difficult political process that it would take to sort of root them out. The second question asked about employment in coal-fired power generation and other polluting sectors and how that might affect the paradox. And I'm unfortunately, because of the amount of time I had, I didn't go into that, but I think the question is spot on. Maintaining full employment in these SOEs is a very important goal for the Chinese government. And I think it, together with satisfying the elite interests in these firms, is a major part of why we see attempts to sort of alleviate the economic pains of overcapacity by investing overseas and especially by turning China into an export powerhouse in the, especially in the energy sector. The third question asks a really important forward-looking perspective on the prospects for cooperation between US and Chinese firms in the energy sector. And I think generally we're at a really interesting inflection point for that, where we probably can't answer that question without looking at the larger state of US-China relations and the larger context of US position on climate change. I think that there's, an optimistic person like myself sees the new Biden administration as much more focused on climate change and also much, at least somewhat more willing to try to find opportunities to cooperate with China. I think that these two interests dovetail really well in the area of clean energy technologies. China has such a comparative advantage and competitive advantage in manufacturing it, especially in PV and wind turbine components, that building these kinds of transnational trade and investment linkages could be a real way for the US and China to kind of buck the trends in conflict and find an opportunity to cooperate that will both set a positive template for the relationship, but also make direct contributions to fighting climate change. So I think that's a real sector to watch in the next couple of years. And then this question of, do we see sort of similar behavioral dimensions of the paradox in destination countries? And I think that's an outstanding question. And I'm actually in the process of designing a survey that specifically thinks about some of these trade-offs in the context of China's overseas investments. How do the political benefits that come from building power plants or any other type of infrastructure that may help economically but have environmental costs, how do citizens in these countries weigh these different costs? How does that affect their evaluations of China and of their own political leaders who are responsible for bringing China in as an investor? I don't think we have good answers to that, but I'm hopefully in a year or two I can tell you.
Thanks so much. Great questions, great answers. We have a couple more here, but I encourage folks to go into the Q&A and ask some questions. We have a question from Rhys Jenkins from the University of East Anglia. Thank you, Rhys. Rhys is the author of a great and comprehensive comparative analysis between China's overseas investment in Latin America and Africa. Highly recommended. Rhys asks, the implication of your analysis seems to be that Chinese companies would tend to build more coal-powered plants abroad relative to renewables than would be the case within China. Do you have any data on this? Then we have a question from Moshahida Sultana. Moshahida is a PhD student at Environmental Sciences and Policy at Central European University. Asks, are coal-fired power projects mostly backed by state-owned businesses? If so, how are the overseas contracts made? Does the government use diplomatic channels to invest overseas? And what about renewables? We have one by Aram Ashraf, independent researcher on CPEC. Says, thank you for adding important notes here, and says, in Pakistan, it seems though that imported coal fuel is more profitable due to the nature of local coal. How do you see this industry progressing in light of hydropower now being harnessed in Pakistan through China? And then the last one for this cluster, I think it'll be the last one for the seminar, so you can answer these and then make any closing remarks you might have, is from James Sundquist, a PhD student in political science at Yale University and a predoctoral fellow here at the Global China Initiative. Says, your explanation for crowding out of greener power within China focused on local elites, provincial governors, mayors, etc. But I lost you on how this logic also applies to China's projects outside its borders. Could you please clarify? So thanks so much for a great presentation, Meir. If you could answer those and make any last remarks, that would be great.
Sure. And I think the first two questions share some really similar themes about state-owned enterprises and the private sector in coal versus renewables. In terms of comparing at the firm level, the propensity to build coal versus renewables within China overseas, as well as the question of how much, to what extent state-owned enterprises are involved in coal-fired power overseas. The answers to this are kind of really closely related. And first of all, just as a stylized fact, there's a much higher likelihood that big coal-fired power plants are state-owned enterprises and are sponsored by state-owned enterprises. Indeed, for a sort of a detailed exposition of this, I would point you to Professor Gallagher and Professor Bo Kong's really great article that came out in Energy Research and Social Science this October, I believe, which looks at some of these specific questions of how ownership in renewables versus ownership in the coal-fired power affects the propensity to invest overseas in the Belt and Road. But because this because these plants are disproportionately, because ownership is disproportionately correlated with sector, it makes a direct comparison of looking at this relationship unfeasible. But I do think that it goes a long ways to explaining the renewables gap and why we see relatively less investment in renewable energy. The next question was about CPEC and sort of given the relatively increased profitability of imported coal, I believe, versus the domestic coal, how we should, and the increased investment in hydropower, how we should think about the trajectory of coal-fired power as part of CPEC. I think it's a really important question, and that it's something that certainly market forces like the price of coal and how profitable it will be, for example, to take coal out of the Thar coal block and other areas within Pakistan will at least partially be the economic determinants of this. But I would hope that one of the takeaways of the analysis that I presented and of some other great research on the environmental consequences of coal-fired power generally and in Pakistan specifically would be that the political process of deciding what kind of generating capacity is installed takes into account the environmental and social costs of coal. Because I think that were the accounting to be more broad-based in this way, and were it to think about how climate change is likely to further the balance, push the balance sheet in one direction, I think then we would see a crowding out of coal and a likelihood of investing in other sources. However, the current political factors driving investment, I don't think are going to be enough to do that until these environmental and sustainability factors are brought in more to the process. And James, your question was sort of about the role of how elites crowd out at the local level within China's energy transition and what kinds of implications this would have. How does this translate into the renewables gap and into overseas investment? And I think, I'll highlight some really interesting preliminary evidence that I have, which suggests that the sort of simplest ways that we have of thinking about that relationship, the ways that I initially thought about, may not be the case. And what I've done in some analyses is looked at firm level pressure from overcapacity in the coal-fired power sector and looked at this as an explanatory variable for sponsorship of coal-fired power overseas. And I don't really find that there's a direct relationship in that way. So what I think is more of a fruitful way of thinking about this relationship between domestic overcrowding and these domestic institutional obstacles and the international environment is that at the macro level, because these domestic institutional obstacles do constrain China's energy transition, it puts a more macro level pressure on the policy banks, on insurers, on ministries and local governments who are involved in boosting and supporting firms that are going out as part of the BRI. It puts a greater role for them to think about how to compensate the losers of domestic reform. It gives these losers more bargaining power because they can point to the fact that they have fewer domestic options. So I'll leave the answer to that there, and I'm happy to answer any more questions if we have time.
Yeah, I think we've run out of time. Thanks so much for a great presentation and some great questions that came out here. To continue this conversation to a certain extent, we heard a lot about coal today. We heard a lot about a little bit about Pakistan. And next week's seminar, same time, same station, so to speak, will be a presentation on the air pollution and health effects in and around Pakistan's coal plant financed by China. And then also want to invite you to next Thursday at 9:30 EST, presentation of a new spatially located data set of Chinese overseas development finance from 2008 to 2019. If you look in the chat, you can click and get links to some of the papers that were discussed today, to join our mailing list to find out more about these kind of events, and to register for those that are happening next week. Until then, be safe, and thank you, Meir, for a great presentation, and thanks all of you for coming. Have a great day.